When my daughter-in-law first called me trash, it wasn't in private. It was in a grand ballroom filled with our hotel's entire staff. I was wearing my navy blue housekeeping uniform, and Vanessa Carter Perez looked at me with pure disgust. She turned to a group of managers and said, "Can someone please remove this old piece of trash before the guests see her?" A few people let out nervous chuckles, but most just looked at the floor. My son Michael was standing just a few feet away. He didn't say a single word. I tightened my grip on my cleaning cart, swallowed the humiliation, and walked away. Because the woman mocking me had no idea that every single crystal chandelier above her head, every digit on her massive paycheck, and every luxury brand she wore only existed because of one signature.
Mine.
Before we get to the day the truth finally came out, let me ask you, have you ever been looked down on by someone who had absolutely no idea who you really were? Tell me about it in the comments and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I read every single one. And if stories about family, resilience, and final justice resonate with you, please hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep sharing these journeys together. I live in a small brick house on the outskirts of Chicago. It's the kind of neighborhood where the rest of my family pretends it doesn't exist. The paint on the front porch is peeling, the mailbox leans a little to the left when the wind gets too high, and the kitchen faucet groans every morning when I turn it on to make coffee. But after my husband Richard passed away, I stopped caring about luxury. The quiet here felt a lot easier to live with than an empty mansion. Most mornings, I wake up before sunrise, pull my graying hair into a neat bun, and drive my old silver Toyota 15 miles into downtown Chicago. By 6:30 a.m., I'm inside the Perez Grand Hotel, wearing my housekeeping uniform, with my name embroidered over the pocket. Penelope. No last name, and that detail matters. Nobody at the hotel knew that Penelope Perez was the sole trustee of the multi-billion-dollar Perez Hospitality Group. To the staff, I was just an old woman pushing a laundry cart through corridors of marble and gold. To be honest, I preferred it that way. When people think you're invisible, they show you exactly who they really are. That morning, I was in the basement laundry room folding towels with Angela Brooks, a woman who had worked for the hotel for over 2 decades. She groaned, rubbing her lower back. "My knees are killing me today," she muttered.
"You should sit down and take a break," I said gently.
Angela let out a dry laugh. "Oh, absolutely not. If Vanessa catches me sitting, I'm as good as gone." Just hearing my daughter-in-law's name made my chest tighten. Angela had no idea Vanessa was married to my son. No one in housekeeping did. For 3 years, I had kept my personal life completely hidden. Angela leaned in closer, dropping her voice. "Have you heard the rumors?" "What rumors?" "They're talking about restructuring again. One of the kitchen managers overheard upper management. They want to phase out the older staff. They're saying we cost the company too much in healthcare benefits." A cold feeling washed over me. Richard would have never allowed that, and neither would I. The Perez Hotel Group wasn't built by executives in custom suits. It was built by exhausted people working overtime. People like Angela, who missed family birthdays and anniversaries just to ensure guests had spotless rooms and hot coffee. People like me. Back in 1981, Richard and I opened our very first motel outside of San Antonio, using money borrowed from his uncle and every penny I had saved from waitressing. I still remember carrying heavy loads of stained linens down 2 flights of stairs, while 7 months pregnant with Michael. Richard used to kiss my forehead and say, "One day, Penelope, we'll build something beautiful of our own." But even after we achieved success, we never forgot what hard work felt like. At least Richard never did.
Loud laughter echoed from the hallway outside. A moment later, Vanessa walked into the laundry room, wearing a cream-coloured designer trench coat that probably cost more than my car. 2 assistants followed closely behind her, holding tablets and coffee cups.
The entire room went tense. Vanessa looked around with open distaste, as if the smell of laundry detergent offended her. "Why is it so hot in here?" she complained.
Nobody answered. Angela stood up perfectly straight next to me. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter Perez?"
Vanessa barely acknowledged her. Then her eyes landed on me. That familiar look immediately washed over her face. Irritation mixed with deep embarrassment. She hated seeing me here. Not because she cared about my well-being, but because my presence tarnished the flawless image she wanted to project to the world. "My goodness," she muttered under her breath. "You're still working this shift?" I smiled politely. "Good morning, Vanessa." One of her assistants looked confused, probably wondering why a housekeeper was speaking so casually to a top executive. Vanessa crossed her arms. "You missed a stain on the third-floor carpet yesterday. I'll go back and check it." "You should have checked it the first time." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Angela stepped forward cautiously. "Actually, that stain happened after a guest spilled wine, right around—" "I wasn't speaking to you," Vanessa snapped. Angela immediately looked down. Something burned hot inside me. It wasn't entirely anger. It was disappointment. A deep, exhausting disappointment. Because I remembered 6 years ago when Michael first brought Vanessa home to meet me. She had been so nervous and sweet. She talked about growing up in Texas, about how her parents struggled to pay the bills. She had even cried at the dinner table, telling me how much she wanted a family that truly cared for one another. I'd believed her. Maybe that was my mistake. Vanessa looked me up and down, then turned to her assistant. "We really need to enforce stricter grooming standards for our staff," she said. "This hotel is supposed to represent luxury." Her eyes lingered meaningfully on my worn-out shoes. Her assistants let out uncomfortable chuckles. I kept my face completely blank. Years ago, words like that would have broken me. But time teaches a woman a valuable lesson. Humiliation has no power over you unless you accept it. Vanessa turned back to me. "And Penelope, please stick to the service elevators from now on. Guests have complained." That one stung. Not because of the words themselves, but because she said it in front of the entire room. I nodded, of course. Satisfied, Vanessa turned and walked away, her high heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Once she disappeared, a heavy silence filled the room. Angela finally whispered, "I'm so sorry." "For what?" "She treats you terribly." I gave her a small smile. Some people spend their whole lives trying to make themselves look important. Angela studied me for a moment before speaking. "You know, you really don't carry yourself like a regular housekeeper." I almost laughed, if only she knew. Later that afternoon, during my lunch break, I sat alone in the employee courtyard, holding a paper cup of hot soup, while watching the snow fall lightly onto the city streets. I used to have lunch in executive dining rooms with investors and politicians, and now I was sitting on a metal bench with cleaners and kitchen staff. Strangely, these people felt much more real than the wealthy circles Vanessa was so desperately trying to climb into. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Michael. For a second, my heart lifted, and I answered right away. "Hello, sweetheart." His voice sounded distant, preoccupied. "Hey, Mum." He said Mom, not Mother. He only used that word when Vanessa wasn't around. "Are you coming over for dinner this Friday?" he asked. I didn't realize I was invited. There was a long silence on the other end. Then he lowered his voice. "Vanessa wants to host some business associates. It would mean a lot if you could make it." I stared at the steam rising from my soup. Once upon a time, whenever I visited Michael, he would beg me to stay longer. Now, even an invitation felt like a negotiation. "I'll think about it," I said softly. Another heavy pause stretched between us. Then his voice dropped even lower. "Mum, if you do come, could you make sure not to wear your work clothes?" That hurt more than any insult Vanessa had ever thrown my way. Cruelty from a stranger is painful, but when the shame comes from your own child, the heartbreak cuts right to the bone. After hanging up, I sat there for a long time, watching the snow pile up along the edges of the courtyard. For the first time in years, I started to wonder if my silence had become a form of weakness. Friday night was colder than usual. The Chicago wind howled through the skyscrapers, stinging my cheeks as I stepped out of my Toyota and looked up at the glass high-rise where Michael and Vanessa lived. Their penthouse sat at the very top, glowing warmly against the dark winter sky like something untouchable. Richard used to love buildings like this. New architecture fascinated him, not because it was expensive, but because he appreciated what human hands could achieve when they worked together. I wrapped my coat tightly around myself, holding a freshly baked peach pie in my hands. When Michael was a boy, he always begged for this pie on his birthday. He used to sit on the kitchen counter, swinging his legs, watching me bake. "Don't burn the crust, Mom," he'd tease. Now those memories felt painfully distant. The elevator ride to the penthouse was completely silent, except for the soft piano music playing through hidden speakers. When the doors opened, I could already hear the sound of laughter echoing through the apartment. A young waitress in a black uniform greeted me stiffly at the door. "You must be Penelope," she said. "Not Mrs. Perez, just Penelope." I smiled politely. "Good evening." The penthouse looked like a spread from an architectural magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sparkling Chicago skyline, and the light from the crystal chandeliers cast sharp shadows across the polished floors. Every inch of the space was meticulously designed to impress, but despite its beauty, it felt cold. Not physically cold, but emotionally vacant. A moment later, Vanessa appeared, wearing a fitted emerald green evening gown and a diamond necklace. "Oh," she said, her tone dropping with disappointment. "You actually came." I ignored the comment and offered the pie. "I brought dessert." Vanessa glanced down at the dish as if I were handing her a bag of trash. "How homemade." Before I could reply, two elegantly dressed couples walked out of the dining room. Vanessa's face instantly transformed into a bright, radiant smile. "There she is," one of the women said. "Vanessa, your apartment is absolutely incredible." Vanessa laughed, her voice carrying a practiced charm. "Thank you. Michael and I barely have time to enjoy it, though. We practically live at the office."
The casual way she claimed the company made my stomach twist.
Michael finally walked out from the hallway, adjusting his dark suit jacket. The moment his eyes met mine, a flash of guilt crossed his face. "Mom," he said quietly. He kissed my cheek quickly, a nervous gesture, before glancing over at Vanessa to gauge her reaction. It was heartbreaking to watch. Vanessa clapped her hands together lightly. "Everyone, this is Michael's mother, Penelope." One of the businessmen smiled politely. "Nice to meet you." Before I could even respond, Vanessa casually added, "She actually handles housekeeping at one of our properties. She just can't stay idle. She likes to keep busy." The energy in the room shifted instantly. The subtle smiles, the polite, condescending nods. It was that imperceptible shift people make when they decide your social standing. I had seen that look 1,000 times before, but hearing it orchestrated by my daughter-in-law felt entirely different. One of the women tilted her head sympathetically. "Oh, well, that's very admirable."
Admirable. How cruel a word can sound when wrapped in pity, but I kept my smile in place.
Dinner began shortly after. The price of the dining table alone could have probably funded the first 2 years of Richard's and my marriage. Vanessa sat at the head of the table next to Michael, holding court like a queen entertaining her subjects. The conversation quickly turned to business. "Our luxury division is outperforming all projections," Vanessa announced proudly, taking a sip of wine. "To be honest, the brand elevation has been revolutionary." Michael nodded tiredly. "Vanessa has spearheaded most of the strategy on that front." "Oh, I basically run the show now," she joked lightly. Everyone laughed. I watched my son closely. Once upon a time, Michael hated arrogance. As a young boy, if another child forgot their lunch at school, he would split us in half without a second thought. Richard loved that gentle quality in him. But somewhere along the way, my son had learned that silence was much easier than conflict. Vanessa suddenly turned to me. "You know, Penelope, we're looking into raising our staffing standards across all hotels." I calmly wiped my mouth with a napkin. "What kind of standards?" "Appearance, energy, efficiency." She offered a hollow smile. "High-end clients don't want to see exhausted staff dragging heavy carts through the hallways." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I looked Vanessa dead in the eye. "The reputation your clients enjoy was built by those very same exhausted employees." Vanessa let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, of course, but times change." One of the businessmen raised his glass. "That's why young leadership is so vital."
Vanessa practically glowed at the compliment.
Suddenly, I remembered another dinner from decades ago. Richard and I were sitting in the tiny office of our very first motel, eating take-out Chinese food. Michael was just a baby, sleeping in a laundry basket next to us, because we couldn't afford a crib yet. Richard looked at our financial reports, sighed, and said, "Penelope, if we ever make it big, promise me one thing." "What's that?" "We will never become the kind of people who forget where they came from." At the time, I thought that promise would be easy to keep. Now I wasn't so sure. Vanessa's voice pulled me back to reality. "Frankly," she continued, Sometimes I think sentimental attachments are what ruin businesses. You have to have the spine to cut the dead weight. Dead weight. There was that phrase again. I noticed Michael staring intently at his plate. Some employees, Vanessa said casually, only stay with the company for as long as they do because management feels guilty. The message was clear. She wasn't just talking about the staff, she was talking about me. One of the women at the table leaned forward. So, how do you handle difficult personnel? Vanessa smiled thinly before answering. You just have to remind them that everyone is replaceable. At that moment, something deep inside me shattered. Not because she had insulted me, but because if Richard could hear these words associated with our family name, it would have broken his heart. I carefully set my fork down. You know, I said softly, when Richard and I started our first motel, we cleaned every single room ourselves. The table went completely quiet. Vanessa smiled politely, the kind of smile people use when tolerating a story they don't care about. But I kept going. One winter, our heating system failed during a massive blizzard. Richard didn't sleep for 36 hours. He went room to room carrying portable heaters to make sure none of our guests froze. Michael looked up at me then. I could see the memory hitting him. He used to say, I added, that a business doesn't survive because of money. It survives because the people inside it believe they matter. Vanessa took a slow sip of her wine. That's a lovely sentiment, she replied smoothly, but modern corporations require more decisive leaders. I stared into her eyes. And compassion is a weakness, right? Vanessa smiled again. No, she said slickly. Compassion is just too expensive. A dead silence fell over the table. Michael finally spoke up. Vanessa? But before he could finish, she cut him off with a wave of her hand. I'm just being realistic, darling. I watched her for a few seconds, and suddenly everything became painfully clear. Vanessa truly believed this company belonged to her world now. The designer dresses, the investors, the illusion of luxury. She had absolutely no idea that the woman she was mocking at dinner still controlled everything beneath her feet. When it came time for dessert, Vanessa didn't even serve the peach pie I brought. Later I noticed it sitting completely untouched on the kitchen counter next to the trash bin. Strangely, that was the detail that hurt the most. When I left the penthouse that night, the snow had picked up again. Michael walked me down to the lobby alone. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then his voice dropped to a shameful whisper. You know how Vanessa gets, Mom. It's just business. I looked at my son, the boy I used to hold through the night when he had a fever, now a man I barely recognized. Yes, I replied softly. I think I finally understand. The law firm of Whitmore and Green sat on the 22nd floor of an old stone building overlooking Lake Michigan. Richard used to joke that Margaret Whitmore chose the location because it looked imposing enough to scare dishonest people before they even walked through the door. On Monday morning, when I stepped out of the elevator, I could already smell the familiar scent of leather-bound books, coffee, and polished wood. Some things never change. Margaret's assistant greeted me warmly. Mrs. Perez, she's expecting you. Mrs. Perez, it's funny how differently people speak to you when they know your last name. The moment I walked into the office, Margaret stood up. At 72, her eyes were still as sharp as shattered glass. Her silver hair perfectly framed her face, and her navy suit was impeccably tailored. But her expression softened the moment she saw me. You look tired, Penelope. I let out a dry laugh. Is it that obvious? Yes, I suppose I am. I sat in the leather chair across from her desk, slowly placing my gloves on my lap. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Margaret had handled Richard's legal affairs for nearly 30 years. She knew every version of me. The ambitious young woman who built a motel empire alongside her husband, the grieving widow after Richard's funeral, and now, the quieter version of me, hiding behind a housekeeping uniform.
Finally, she pushed a thick manila folder across the desk. I wish I had called you in for something more pleasant.
My stomach tightened. I opened the folder carefully. Layoff projections, healthcare cost-cutting initiatives, personnel restructuring proposals. At the top of several pages, Vanessa's digital signature of approval was boldly stamped. I read through the documents in silence, a cold anger spreading through my chest. They want to let 43 people go? I asked quietly. Margaret nodded. Most of them are over 55, she added. Housekeeping, laundry, kitchen staff, maintenance. I flipped the page. Projected annual savings, insurance reduction targets, outsourced labour estimates. The language on the paper looked so clean, so completely devoid of humanity. Just numbers on a spreadsheet. But I knew the people behind those numbers. Angela, whose husband was battling illness. Mr. Delaney in maintenance, who was raising a child with special needs. Maria in laundry, who was supporting 3 grandchildren. These were people whose names Vanessa probably never even bothered to learn. I slowly closed the folder. When was this submitted? 3 weeks ago. And Michael approved this? Margaret hesitated. It's complicated. No, I said softly. It's not complicated at all. The silence between us grew heavy. Finally, Margaret reached into her drawer and pulled out another document, sliding it toward me. It was Richard's trust agreement. Even after all these years, seeing his signature still brought a pang to my heart. My fingers lightly traced the ink on the page. Richard updated the trust 6 months before he passed, Margaret said gently. Do you remember? Of course I remembered. Richard knew the illness was spreading by then, even though he pretended everything was fine in front of Michael. He spent his final months carefully organising everything, not for himself, but for me, for the company, and for our son. You still hold the absolute majority control through the trust, Margaret continued. 51%. Michael is the chief operating officer, but the final executive authority belongs to you.
I looked out the window at the grey Chicago skyline.
When Michael was young, I whispered, Richard believed he would naturally grow into the leadership role. Margaret crossed her hands on her desk. Richard also worried that Michael was too desperate for approval. That statement hit the painful truth. Michael had always hated letting people down. Even as a child, if 2 friends fought at school, he would cry trying to make both sides happy. If Richard raised his voice, Michael immediately blamed himself, even if he had done nothing wrong. He had a gentle heart, and gentle hearts often attract controlling people. Margaret studied me closely. Did you ever tell Michael that you still have full control over the trust? No. Why? Because I wanted my son to love me for who I was, not because of the immense wealth that stood between us. But I couldn't say that out loud. Instead, I looked back down at Richard's signature. He wanted Michael to earn his confidence through his own actions, I said softly. Not inherit it. Margaret nodded slowly. Then she picked up another folder. This one might be harder to read. Inside were expense reports, luxury event receipts, private travel vouchers, and invoices for designer consultants. I frowned. What is this? Vanessa's expenses? The numbers were staggering. A single dinner event cost nearly $80,000. Another page showed company funds being used for personal branding and influencer partnerships. She filed these under corporate entertainment accounts? I asked. Yes. I looked up sharply. Does Michael know? I suspect that whatever document she puts in front of him, he simply signs. That certainly sounded like my son lately. Too tired to fight, wanting to avoid conflict at all costs. Margaret leaned back in her chair. There's more. She handed me several printed emails. One email, written by Vanessa, read, Older staff damage our luxury aesthetic. Younger employees create a more appealing brand identity. Another stated, Sentimentality is eating into our profit margins. I read every single word slowly. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking, not from shock, but from absolute heartbreak. The Perez Grand Hotel used to be recognized as one of the best employers in the industry. Richard used to visit the hotel kitchens on holidays, personally thanking the staff working the Christmas shifts. 20 years ago, when a cleaner's wife passed away unexpectedly, Richard secretly paid for the funeral expenses out of his own pocket. He truly believed the staff was family. Vanessa saw them as replaceable props. Margaret's voice turned cautious. Penelope, if these layoffs go through, lawsuits will follow. The age discrimination alone could severely damage public trust. I closed my eyes briefly. For years I had kept myself hidden because the grief of losing Richard had changed me. Facing the public eye without him by my side felt unbearable. And truth be told, a part of me hoped Michael would find his footing on his own. But perhaps my silence had allowed something ugly to grow unchecked. Margaret watched me quietly before speaking again. Richard told me something after Michael got married. I looked up. He said, Vanessa confuses appearance with value. A wave of sorrow washed over me. Richard had seen it too, even back then. And he added, Margaret said carefully, if Penelope completely steps away, there will be no one left to protect the soul of this company. Those words nearly broke me, because I suddenly realized something terrible. I hadn't just given up power. I had abandoned a responsibility. This company belonged to more than just us. Thousands of families relied on it. Margaret finally asked the question that had been hanging between us all morning. What do you want to do?
I stared out at the snow-covered skyline. A long moment passed in complete silence.
Then I asked calmly, when is the anniversary gala? 3 weeks from now. I nodded slowly. Every year, the Perez Hospitality Group hosted a grand gala to celebrate the company's founding. Investors, executives, media, and board members all attended. Vanessa loved that event. It was her favourite stage. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. I will be attending as well, Penelope. For the first time all morning, a faint smile appeared on Margaret's face. Perfect. I stood up and reached for my coat, but stopped near the door before leaving. Margaret. Yes? If Richard were here. My voice caught slightly. Would he feel like I let Michael down? Her expression softened completely. No, she said firmly. I think Richard would think you loved him enough to wait for the right moment to step in. The elevator ride down felt incredibly heavy, not because I feared the confrontation, but because deep down, I knew everything had changed. For years I had convinced myself that my silence was a form of kindness, but silence had protected the wrong people. Somewhere between my housekeeping uniform and corporate lies, my family had forgotten what the name Perez actually stood for. Maybe it was time to remind them. The housekeeping break room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and bleach. By 7 a.m., most of us were already exhausted. Angela sat at the small plastic table, rubbing her wrists, while Maria from laundry sat near the vending machine, quietly counting the coins in her wallet. I stood by the counter, stirring creamer into my stale coffee, noticing how quiet everyone had become lately. Fear changes the atmosphere of a workplace. People stop laughing out loud. They whisper instead. They look over their shoulders before speaking. Over the past week, anxiety had spread through the hotel faster than a winter cold. Angela finally broke the silence. My husband's treatment got delayed again, she murmured. Maria looked up instantly. Why? An issue with the insurance paperwork? Angela forced a smile that didn't fool anyone. The hospital said we need approval from the corporate office first. I sat down slowly beside her. How is he feeling? Tired? Her voice trembled slightly. Some days he can barely stand.
Angela had given 22 years of her life to the Perez Grand Hotel. 22 years, long enough to see entire management teams come and go. Long enough to miss countless holidays, school plays, and anniversaries. And now she sat here trembling because an executive decision could strip away her medical security.
It made me sick to my stomach. Before I could respond, the break room door swung open, banging loudly against the wall. Vanessa walked in, holding a tablet and an iced coffee. 2 nervous-looking HR managers following behind her. The room went completely dead silent. Vanessa looked around with clear impatience. Why is everyone sitting? She demanded sharply. Despite the pain evident on her face, Angela stood up immediately. We're on our scheduled break, she said quietly. Vanessa checked her watch dramatically. Well, break time is over. Nobody argued. Nobody ever argued. That was what I hated most. Fear teaches good people how to make themselves small. Vanessa's eyes landed on me next. She frowned slightly, as if my very presence bored her. You, she said, pointing toward the cart in the hallway. The ballroom trim has dust on it. Go handle it. You should have taken care of it hours ago. Her tone was as dismissive as ever, the way she always spoke to me when others were watching. One of the HR managers shifted uncomfortably beside her. Vanessa turned back to the room. A conference room, 10 minutes, mandatory staff meeting. With that, she turned and walked out. The moment the door closed, Angela let out a shaky breath. Maria muttered under her breath, That woman terrifies me. I stared into my coffee cup. No, Vanessa didn't terrify me anymore. She disappointed me. There's a big difference. 10 minutes later, nearly 40 employees crowded into a plain conference room downstairs. Housekeepers leaned against the back wall, while kitchen staff and maintenance workers filled the chairs. No one spoke.
Vanessa stood confidently by the projector screen, wearing a tailored white suit that made her look more like a politician than a hospitality executive. Michael stood off to the side next to our Chief Financial Officer, Marcus Hill. My son looked exhausted. Dark circles rimmed his eyes and his shoulders slumped beneath his expensive suit jacket. He barely glanced at the staff as they walked in. Once everyone settled, Vanessa flashed a bright smile. "Thank you all for coming," she began smoothly. "As you know, the Perez Hospitality Group is entering a new era. Corporate jargon, always the precursor to something painful." She clicked the presentation remote, and a chart appeared on the screen. "The luxury market is evolving," Vanessa continued. "To remain competitive, we must modernize our operations and maximize efficiency." I noticed several employees exchanging anxious glances. Vanessa kept going. "Unfortunately, that means making difficult decisions." There it was. Angela looked down immediately. Maria clenched her hands together. Vanessa paced slowly in front of the screen like a motivational speaker. "Certain roles within the company no longer align with our long-term brand vision. Roles, not people. That's the language executives use when they want to detach themselves from guilt." Michael finally spoke up softly. "Vanessa," but she carried right over his voice. "We need energy, adaptability, and flawless presentation. Frankly, certain departments are carrying dead weight." The room froze. Dead weight. I saw Angela flinch beside me. Maria's eyes filled with tears. One of the maintenance workers muttered a quiet curse under his breath. Vanessa ignored it. "We will begin evaluating employee performance immediately. Staff members who do not meet our updated criteria may face termination." Termination. Such a polite word for destroying someone's livelihood. I looked at Michael. He was staring blankly at the table. Not protecting them, not stopping her, just surviving alongside her. Somehow that hurt more than Vanessa's coldness. A young housekeeper in the back raised a trembling hand. "What about our medical benefits?" Vanessa's expression barely shifted. "Those details are still being finalized." The young woman swallowed hard. "My mother has surgery next month." Vanessa let out an impatient sigh. This is exactly the kind of emotional thinking that hurts business decisions. At that moment, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet, but something much colder. "Resolve." Angela suddenly spoke up beside me, her voice cautious but respectful. "Some of us have given decades to this company, ma'am." Vanessa looked directly at her. "And the company compensated you for your work?" Angela's face went pale. I couldn't stay silent any longer. "Loyalty isn't a liability," I said calmly. Every eye in the room turned toward me. Vanessa blinked slowly. "Excuse me?" I stood up straighter. "People built this company," I continued, "not branding campaigns." Vanessa let out a short, dismissive laugh. "That conversation is far above your pay grade, Penelope." A few awkward chuckles rippled through the room. My cheeks burned, but I kept my expression perfectly calm. Vanessa took a step closer. "You clean rooms," she said, her voice dropping to that low, vicious tone she used when she wanted to be cruel without raising her voice. "You don't understand executive strategy." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, looking me up and down in front of everyone, she added, "Frankly, there's already enough old trash cluttering the hotel hallways." Angela gasped softly. Maria looked horrified. Even Marcus Hill shifted uncomfortably. But Michael said nothing, not a single word. I looked at my son for what felt like an eternity, silently begging him, "Just once, stand up and say something." But he just rubbed his forehead tiredly, staring at the floor. Suddenly, a devastating truth hit me. Michael wasn't protecting Vanessa because he agreed with her. He was protecting himself from conflict. That kind of weakness destroys a family from the inside out. Vanessa turned away dismissively. Meeting adjourned. The staff began filing out silently, many wiping tears from their faces. Angela stayed by my side as we walked out. "I'm so sorry," she whispered again. I forced a smile. "You have nothing to apologize for." But my heart felt heavy. This company used to stand for something beautiful. Richard used to know the staff by name. He attended their funerals, their children's graduations, and their retirement dinners. He believed that business without humanity was poison. And now his son stood by silently while they were humiliated like disposable objects. After the room emptied, I stayed behind to gather some papers left on the tables. That's when I noticed someone approaching quietly. It was Olivia Reed, a young assistant from the executive department. She looked terrified. "Mrs. Perez," she whispered. "Yes?" She glanced nervously toward the hallway, then slid a folded envelope into my hand. "You didn't get this from me." I frowned slightly. "What is this?" "Internal HR projections," she she whispered quickly, and copies of executive expense approvals.
My heart slowed down. Why are you giving this to me? Olivia looked toward the door one last time. Then she said softly, because good people are terrified right now, and someone needs to stop her. Before I could answer, she hurried away. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. It felt heavy, important, and dangerous. I slid it slowly into my bag. Then I took one last look around the empty conference room. The polished table, the expensive lighting, the framed corporate slogans on the wall. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an exhausted old housekeeper anymore. I was starting to remember exactly who I was. I didn't open Olivia's envelope until after midnight. The house was dead quiet, save for the ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint hum of the wind outside. Snow tapped gently against the window pane as I sat alone at the dining table under the old chandelier Richard had installed nearly 30 years ago. I made a cup of tea first. Richard always said you should never read bad news without a warm cup of tea in your hands. My fingers felt cold as I unfolded the papers. Expense reports, internal approvals, invoices for luxury trips charged directly to the Perez Grand Hotel. I adjusted my reading glasses and kept turning the pages. Private spa bookings, designer wardrobe allowances, a $70,000 brand dinner in Manhattan, a 3-day executive retreat in Napa Valley, where the champagne consumption apparently far outweighed the business meetings. All of it approved under Vanessa's department. My jaw tightened, but what I saw next was far worse. Projected salary reduction targets, termination schedules for long-term staff, healthcare liability calculations. It was all there in black and white. Vanessa wasn't just trying to impress investors. She was funding her personal luxury lifestyle by stripping away the security of the very people who had built the company. I closed the folder carefully and leaned back in my chair, staring into the dark kitchen for several minutes. I kept thinking about Angela, about Maria, and about the palpable fear in that conference room. Beneath it all lay a bitter truth I could no longer ignore. I had allowed this to happen. Not intentionally, but silence always carries a cost. My phone rang suddenly, startling me. "Margaret," I said, answering immediately. "Is everything all right?" "Marcus Hill wants to meet with you tomorrow morning," she said, getting straight to the point. "Privately." "About Vanessa?" "Yes." Her tone told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, just after 8 a.m., I walked into a small coffee shop a few blocks from the corporate headquarters. Marcus Hill sat alone in a back booth, wearing a dark coat, looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. He stood up nervously when he saw me. "Mrs. Perez." I offered a gentle smile. "You can still call me Penelope, Marcus." He hesitated before sitting back down. Marcus had been with the Perez Hotel Group for 15 years. Richard trusted him implicitly because he valued honesty over charm. If Marcus looked this nervous, things were serious. After the waitress brought our coffee, neither of us spoke right away. Finally, Marcus pushed a thin tablet across the table. "I don't know how much Margaret has already shared with you. Enough to know I should have stepped in a long time ago."
Marcus let out a heavy sigh. Over the past 18 months, Vanessa's spending has escalated dramatically.
I tapped the financial reports on the screen. The numbers spoke for themselves. Marketing inflation, luxury consulting fees, and questionable reimbursements funneled through corporate accounts. Then I noticed something else. "These approvals," I said calmly. "They still require authorization from the trust." Marcus nodded grimly. "They do. Michael has been signing off on them." "And the layoffs?" Vanessa convinced him that without these cuts, the luxury division wouldn't hit its quarterly targets for the investors. She told him it was the only way to modernize the brand. Marcus looked me directly in the eye. "Michael didn't want to sign them, Penelope. I watched him hesitate for 3 days. But Vanessa, she knows exactly how to handle him. She told him that if he didn't have the courage to make the hard choices, he wasn't fit to carry his father's legacy." A sharp pain pierced my chest. She used Richard's memory to manipulate our son into destroying everything Richard loved. "The gala is in 2 weeks, Marcus said quietly. "Vanessa plans to announce the corporate restructuring and the new luxury brand identity there. If she does, those 43 families lose everything by the end of the month." I stared into my coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. I thought about the first motel we owned, about the nights Richard and I stayed up calculating numbers down to the penny just to ensure our 2 employees got their Christmas bonuses. "Does Vanessa know we're meeting?" I asked. No, Marcus said. She thinks I'm finalizing the severance packages. I looked up, my resolve hardening into something unbreakable. Do not finalize them, Marcus. He looked at me, a sudden spark of hope in his eyes. What are you going to do? I'm going to attend the gala, I said softly. The night of the 45th anniversary gala arrived with a fierce winter storm. The wind whipped snow across the grand entrance of the Perry's Grand Hotel, where sleek black limousines were arriving in a steady stream. Inside, the ballroom was a spectacle of absolute opulence. Ice sculptures gleamed under thousands of fairy lights, jazz music floated through the air, and hundreds of Chicago's elite mingled with champagne glasses in hand. I arrived early, but I didn't enter through the front doors. I walked through the basement entrance, punched my time card, and put on my navy blue housekeeping uniform one last time. As I pushed my laundry cart through the back corridors toward the main ballroom floor, I saw Angela and Maria setting up the linen stations. They looked tired, their eyes heavy with the anxiety of the impending layoffs. Penelope, Angela whispered as I passed. What are you doing working the gala shift? I thought you took the night off. I have a few things to take care of, Angela, I said with a warm smile. Don't worry. By 8 p.m., the ballroom doors opened fully, and the room filled to capacity. I stood near the back corner, blending into the shadows with my cleaning cart, watching the spectacle. Vanessa was in her absolute element. She wore a stunning, custom-made white silk gown that practically shimmered under the spotlights. She glided from table to table, laughing gracefully, shaking hands with billionaires and politicians. Michael followed a step behind her, looking pale and hollowed out in his tuxedo. He looked like a ghost at his own celebration. Suddenly, Vanessa's eyes caught me standing by the service entrance. Her smile instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of pure rage. She excused herself from a group of investors and marched straight toward me, her heels clicking furiously against the marble. Are you completely losing your mind? She hissed, her voice a lethal whisper. What are you doing on the ballroom floor in that disgusting uniform? I told you to stay in the service areas. I'm just doing my job, Vanessa, I said quietly. Your job is to be invisible, she snapped. She looked around frantically to see if anyone was watching. Get out of here right now. If I see your face on this floor again tonight, I will personally throw you out into the snow. Before I could answer, the master of ceremonies took the stage, his voice booming through the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the visionaries behind the new era of Perez hospitality, co-CEO Michael Perez and Executive Vice President Vanessa Carter Perez. The crowd erupted into applause. Vanessa smoothed her dress, flashed her perfect corporate smile, and walked gracefully up the steps onto the stage. Michael followed slowly, taking his place beside her. Vanessa took the microphone. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, she began, her voice radiating confidence. 45 years ago, this company began with a single motel. Tonight, we are proud to announce that the Perez Group is launching an exclusive, ultra-luxury tier. To achieve this, we have streamlined our operations, eliminating outdated practices and restructuring our personnel to ensure only the highest standard of excellence. Behind her, a massive digital screen lit up with the new corporate logo. We are cutting the dead weight, Vanessa announced proudly, and paving the way for a more profitable modern future. The investors clapped. Vanessa beamed with pride. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the side of the stage. The only dead weight in this company, Vanessa, is the greed sitting at the top. The ballroom went completely dead silent. The music stopped. Margaret Whitmore stepped onto the stage, dressed in a sharp black suit, holding a leather portfolio. Beside her walked Marcus Hill. Vanessa's smile froze. Margaret, what is the meaning of this? This is a private corporate presentation. This is a formal meeting of the Perez Trust, Margaret replied, her voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. And as legal counsel to the trust, I am here to inform you that your presentation is unauthorized. Vanessa let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, looking at the crowd. Michael, do something. Your father's old lawyer is having some sort of episode. Michael didn't move. He just stared at Margaret, his eyes wide. Margaret turned to the audience. For the past 18 months, Vanessa Carter Perez has systematically defrauded this company, utilizing corporate funds for personal luxury expenses, totaling over $2 million. Furthermore, she has attempted to authorize mass layoffs under false pretenses, violating the founding bylaws of the Perez Hospitality Group. Murmurs broke out across the ballroom. Flashbulbs from reporters began going off rapidly. Vanessa's face turned an ugly shade of crimson. "This is slander. You have no authority here. Michael and I own this company." "No, Vanessa," Margaret said calmly. "You don't." Margaret turned toward the back of the room. "The majority shareholder and sole trustee of the Perez Hospitality Group would like to speak." Every head in the ballroom turned toward the back. I stepped out from the shadows. I left my cleaning cart behind and walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. I was still wearing my navy blue housekeeping uniform, my worn-out work shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. The silence was deafening. As I reached the stage, the housekeepers and kitchen staff standing near the walls stared at me in absolute shock. Angela's mouth was wide open. Vanessa watched me approach, her eyes practically bulging out of her head. "What are you doing? Someone call security. Get this trash off the stage." "The only person leaving tonight, Vanessa, is you," I said clearly as I walked up the stairs. I stood at the center microphone. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, then at the staff lining the walls, and finally at my son. "My name is Penelope Perez," I said, my voice echoing throughout the grand room. 35 years ago, my husband Richard and I built this hotel with our own 2 hands. We didn't build it on luxury branding or profit margins. We built it on the backs of the hard-working people who clean the rooms, cook the food, and serve the guests. I turned to look directly at Vanessa, whose face was now entirely pale. "You called the staff dead weight," I said softly. "You called me trash. But without the people in this room, you are nothing. You've spent the last year treating human beings like disposable objects to fund your lifestyle." "Michael," Vanessa shrieked, grabbing his arm. Tell them she's crazy." Michael slowly pulled his arm out of her grip. He looked at me, tears streaming down his face, and for the first time in years, he found his voice. "She's not crazy, Vanessa," Michael whispered, his voice trembling but clear. "She's my mother, and she owns the company." Vanessa stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at the crowd, then at the flashing cameras, realizing in one horrific moment that the entire world was watching her ruin unfold. I turned back to the microphone. "As majority trustee, my first official act tonight is to cancel all proposed layoffs. Effective immediately, our employee healthcare benefits will be fully restored and expanded." The housekeepers and kitchen staff in the back suddenly burst into tears and cheers. Angela clapped her hands over her face, weeping tears of pure relief. "My second act," I continued, looking directly at my daughter-in-law, "is to terminate the employment of Vanessa Carter Perez for gross financial misconduct. The legal team has already filed a formal dispute to freeze your corporate accounts, and a full forensic audit will begin tomorrow morning." Vanessa looked at Michael, begging with her eyes, but my son turned his back on her, walking over to stand by my side. Left completely alone on the stage, exposed in front of the city's elite, Vanessa gathered the skirts of her expensive silk gown and ran off the stage in tears, the flashes of the paparazzi following her all the way out the door. The ballroom slowly emptied after that, leaving only the staff behind. I walked down from the stage, and before I could even say a word, Angela threw her arms around me, hugging me tightly. "You're the owner," she cried, laughing through her tears. "Penelope, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to see the hotel through your eyes, Angela," I said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "And I promise you, as long as I am here, your family will always be taken care of." An hour later, the ballroom was quiet. The lights had been dimmed, and the grand tables stood empty. I sat on the edge of the stage, my feet dangling over the side, finally kicking off my worn-out work shoes. Michael came and sat down right next to me. He had taken off his bow tie, and his head was buried in his hands. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I was so afraid of losing everything, of failing Dad's memory. I let it change me into someone I hate." I reached over and pulled my son into a tight embrace, just like I used to when he was a little boy. "Your father never cared about the money, Michael," I told him softly. "He cared about your heart. You lost your way, but tonight, you found your voice again. That's all that matters." He leaned his head against my shoulder, crying quietly in the stillness of the massive room. Tomorrow there would be lawyers, audits, and a long road of rebuilding ahead. But as I looked out at the empty, beautiful ballroom, I knew the soul of the Perry's Grand Hotel was finally safe.
We had remembered exactly who we were.
Marcus nodded grimly. Every major expenditure within the Perry's hospitality group ultimately had to be funneled through the family trust created by Richard before his passing. And I was the only person with signing authority. The system had been built intentionally to protect the company from reckless leadership. This meant one thing. Vanessa had never bothered to learn how the company actually operated. She only cared about the aesthetics, believing Michael controlled it all. "What about Michael?" I asked. Marcus gave me a weary look. "Your son signs whatever document keeps the peace at home." The truth stung because it was undeniable. When Michael first graduated from business school and started working alongside Richard, he questioned everything. He used to be thoughtful, curious, and deeply compassionate. Now he just looked perpetually exhausted and somehow smaller. Marcus dropped his voice. "She is pushing to execute the mass layoffs right after the anniversary gala dinner." "How fast?" "As soon as the dinner ends." I stared at him. Of course. Vanessa wanted to enjoy the applause before announcing the cuts. To her, public perception was far more important than people's livelihoods. Marcus rubbed his forehead tiredly. I tried to warn Michael privately.
What did he say?
He said Vanessa was under pressure from the investors. I almost laughed. Investors, the convenient, invisible enemy executives, always blame when they want an excuse to act cruelly. Richard used to say something entirely different. Once money is involved, leadership reveals character faster than anything else. Marcus studied me closely. "Can I ask you an honest question?" "Of course." "Why did you stay hidden for so long?" The weight of the question hung heavily between us. I looked down at my coffee. Because after Richard passed away, I didn't recognize myself anymore. Grief had hollowed me out to the point where I couldn't stomach boardrooms, interviews, or gala speeches. Watching Michael try to build a future on his own felt healthier than tightly gripping onto control. And perhaps a part of me hoped my son would remember who he was on his own, without me forcing him to. Instead, I simply said, "I thought stepping back would help Michael grow." Marcus nodded slowly, responding in a quiet tone. "Sometimes, good people mistake absence for trust."
Those words echoed in my mind long after the meeting ended.
By early evening, I was back in my housekeeping uniform, entering the hotel through the employee tunnel. It is strange how instantly people's attitudes change based on what you wear. In executive meetings, people listen intently. In the housekeeping corridors, they barely glance your way.
As I approached the West Ballroom, Angela was running the vacuum.
"Are you doing all right?" I asked softly. She managed a faint smile. "Just tired," but her eyes were red.
I gently touched her arm. "What happened?"
Angela swallowed hard before answering. "My husband's doctor called this morning." Her voice trembled. "The treatment is working, but we absolutely cannot lose our insurance right now."
My heart ached. She looked so deeply ashamed saying it, as if struggling just to survive was something to be embarrassed about.
In that moment, I wanted to tell her everything. To tell her the layoffs weren't going to happen, that this company still belonged to someone who remembered the value of its workers, and that she wasn't disposable. But I couldn't, not yet. Instead, I squeezed her hand gently. "You've given so many years to this company," I told her. "Never forget your worth." Angela gave a sad smile. "People like us are easily replaced." No, that was the lie Vanessa had drilled into everyone. Powerful people often maintain their position by making the people at the bottom feel invisible. Loud laughter suddenly echoed down the corridor. Vanessa appeared, walking alongside Michael and two event coordinators, discussing the preparations for the anniversary gala. "The floral arrangements must look more high-end," Vanessa commanded sharply. "I want the entire evening to drip with luxury." Then she saw me. Her expression instantly shifted into irritation, embarrassment, and disgust. "Why is this cart still here?" she snapped. I looked calmly at the cart. "I'm restocking linens for the banquet hall." Vanessa let out a dramatic sigh. "Can we please not have housekeeping wandering through the executive areas while the gala is being set up?" Michael glanced at me briefly. For a split second, guilt flashed across his face again, but then he looked away. Vanessa kept talking as if I didn't exist. "This event is drawing investors from New York and Los Angeles. Image is everything." Something deep inside me finally hardened completely. In that moment, There was no anger, only absolute clarity, because I suddenly understood something vital. Vanessa truly believed that luxury gave her power. But real power is much quieter than that. Real power is signing the checks. Real power is protecting others. Real power never needs to call attention to itself to prove it exists. Vanessa turned to me again, impatient. All right, move the cart. I met her gaze calmly, refusing to look down for the first time. The gesture caught her off guard, causing a brief flicker of unease to cross her face. It was just enough for me to notice. Perfect. Because at the anniversary gala in 3 weeks, the very night she was obsessively preparing to be crowned queen, the entire world she supported on her designer heels was about to shift beneath her feet. And this time, I wasn't going to stay silent. I used to think that cruel people were simply born that way. Time taught me that it isn't always the case. Sometimes, cruelty grows slowly in the hearts of those who spend their entire lives terrified of being insignificant. And Vanessa Carter Perez had spent most of her life living in fear. I knew it even before Michael married her. Back then, her smile was still genuine, her laugh didn't sound so practiced, and the way she looked at my son suggested she saw a safe harbor, not a status symbol. When she first visited our home years ago, she cried while helping me wash the dishes. I know it sounds stupid, she admitted softly, but I've never had a family dinner that felt this peaceful. I remember listening to her as I slowly dried the plates. Her father struggled with addiction, her mother worked 2 jobs, and debt collectors called the house constantly. Vanessa told me she spent her entire high school years pretending she wasn't poor. I used to hide the shoes I bought from thrift stores in my locker, she confessed with an embarrassed laugh. I would change into them right before class because kids could be so mean. Back then, my heart broke for her. Now I realized that during those years, something vital inside Vanessa had broken along with the poverty. It had filled her with so much shame that her entire adult identity became built on escaping it. Somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing regular workers as human beings and began viewing them as the very past she was desperate to outrun. 3 days after my meeting with Marcus, I arrived at the hotel much earlier than usual. A blizzard had frozen half the city overnight, and exhausted employees dragged their feet through the lobby, holding wet boots and coffee cups. Meanwhile, Vanessa stood near the front desk, directing a photography crew.
No, she said sharply. The florals need to look effortless, not cheap.
A stylist nervously ran forward to adjust the arrangement. I pushed my cleaning cart quietly toward the elevator, hoping to avoid drawing attention. Naturally, Vanessa spotted me immediately. She narrowed her eyes. Why is there a cleaning cart visible during a media prep session? One of the photographers glanced over at me awkwardly. I kept my tone even. Guess still need clean rooms? Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. Why does everything have to be so difficult here? Michael stood nearby, reviewing documents on a tablet. He looked distant again, tired and detached. I wondered if he even recognized himself anymore. Vanessa turned back to the photographers, instantly flashing a brilliant smile, as if nothing unpleasant had happened. All right, let's continue. The moment wealthy guests or cameras were present, her voice and demeanor transformed completely. That was Vanessa's true talent. Shape-shifting. By lunchtime, snippets of the hotel's social media video were already online. Olivia showed it to me while we folded sheets in the supply room. Vanessa stood under the crystal chandeliers, speaking eloquently about the future of luxury hospitality. The video already had thousands of likes. She's very good on camera, Olivia admitted cautiously. Yes, I said quietly. She is. Charm was never Vanessa's issue. A lack of empathy was. Olivia hesitated, dropping her voice lower. I found more expense approvals. I looked up immediately. How bad is it? She bit her lip. Worse than before. After my shift that evening, Olivia met me secretly in the underground parking lot. She looked terrified throughout the encounter. If anyone finds out I gave you these, she whispered, I won't let that happen.
She handed me another envelope. Inside were executive billing records tied directly to Vanessa's office. Personal luxury shopping items written off through marketing accounts, influencer gifting schemes, and even a jewelry purchase hidden under branding consultant fees.
I stared at the total amount in disbelief. It wasn't thousands of dollars. It was millions. Millions. What about Michael? I asked quietly. Has he seen these? Olivia looked conflicted. I don't think he reads what he's signing anymore. The answer was heartbreaking because I already knew it was true. Michael used to question everything. When he first joined the company after business school, Richard taught him carefully. Review every contract. Listen more than you speak. Respect the staff. And never treat the company's money as personal wealth. But grief changes a person. Marriage changes a person too, especially when love slowly turns into an emotional struggle for survival. The next morning, Marcus called, requesting another private meeting. This time, we met in his office before the executives arrived. Financial reports piled high across his desk, and he looked worse than before. "Tell me honestly," he said quietly, after closing the door. "How far are you willing to go?" I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Vanessa believes she will eventually become the CEO directly." He pushed another document toward me. "She's already discussing future restructuring plans with investors." I read through the proposal carefully. Luxury rebranding, executive expansion, mass layoffs, increased automation, and cutting employee housing stipends. It was everything Richard had hated most. My stomach churned. "She's trying to build a company entirely on superficial engineering," I whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. "She believes investors value surface image over loyalty. Richard used to say that investors follow confidence temporarily, but employee alignment determines whether a business survives permanently." I slowly sat down. "Marcus, why haven't you resigned?" He gave a tired smile. "Because someone has to protect what's left." That answer stayed with me all day, protecting what's left. By evening, the anniversary gala planning meeting had completely taken over the hotel ballroom. Designers moved floral arrangements across the marble floors, while catering staff tested menu samples under Vanessa's supervision. I quietly cleared tables near the stage, pretending not to listen. Vanessa stood beside several event coordinators, reviewing the guest list. "These donors get priority seating," she instructed, "and make sure the staff remains completely invisible during the cocktail hour." Invisible. There was that word again, as if the very presence of the workers would ruin the sense of luxury. A young coordinator asked nervously, "Do we need to reserve a seat for Mrs. Perez?" Vanessa stiffened briefly, then laughed easily. "Oh, Penelope doesn't attend these kinds of events." Hearing that, I almost laughed out loud. "You have no idea what's coming, darling." Michael entered the ballroom halfway through the meeting, looking completely worn out. Vanessa immediately walked over to him. "Did you look at the investor brief?" "Not yet." "You need to stay focused, Michael." Her tone turned sharp. "This dinner is incredibly important." Michael rubbed his forehead. "I know, no distractions this time." Her gaze briefly flicked over to me. I read the message in her eyes clearly. I was the distraction. Not her fraud, not her sharpness, and not the financial abuse. But me. Michael noticed too. For one painful second, our eyes met across the ballroom, and I saw shame in his eyes. Real shame. But shame without courage changes nothing. Late that night, I returned home with another thick stack of documents in my bag. The house felt colder than usual. I stood in the kitchen, staring at an old photograph hanging near the refrigerator. It was a picture of Richard and me at the opening of our very first motel. We looked exhausted and poor, but completely happy. I gently touched the edge of the frame. "You were right," I whispered to him. Richard had warned me once that if power was involved, unresolved insecurities would eventually turn into cruelty. At the time, I believed love could heal anyone. Now I understood that love can guide people, but ultimately, character determines whether they are willing to listen. My phone vibrated suddenly. It was Michael. After 3 rings, I answered. "Hello, sweetheart."
His voice sounded tense. "Mom, are you free Friday night?"
"What's happening Friday?" "Vanessa is hosting a private investor dinner before the gala." He hesitated. "She wants everyone there."
Everyone. What a dangerous word in a family. I leaned slowly against the kitchen counter. "So, she wants me there?"
Silence. It stretched on far too long. Finally, Michael answered quietly. "She wants things to look united as a family." I closed my eyes briefly. Not to be loved, not to be welcomed, but to be managed, displayed, and controlled, just like everything else in Vanessa's world. But this time, something inside me had changed. Because while Vanessa was busy creating a perfect image every day, I was quietly gathering the truth hidden beneath it all. And the truth always outlasts a false appearance once it collapses. The night of the anniversary gala arrived in a blur of ice and silver moonlight. Downtown Chicago sparkled under the winter sky as a long line of black luxury sedans formed at the entrance of the Perez Grand Hotel. Outside the ballroom, camera flashes went off continuously. Investors, executives, politicians, and socialites walked the red carpet in tailored tuxedos and diamonds. Inside, the light from the chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors, while a string quartet played softly near the grand staircase. Everything looked perfect. Vanessa had ensured it. I stood alone in my bedroom, staring at the navy blue garment bag hanging on the closet door. For nearly 20 minutes I couldn't bring myself to unzip it, because inside was the gown Richard had bought me 15 years ago for our 30th anniversary. It was the last formal event we had attended together. Finally, I slowly opened the bag. Deep emerald silk, elegant and simple. Richard used to say I looked beautiful in green because it made my eyes brighter. My fingers trembled slightly as I touched the fabric. Grief is a strange thing. Even after all these years, certain memories still feel close enough to tear you apart. For a moment, I almost decided not to go. Perhaps Margaret could handle the board announcement without me. Perhaps exposing Vanessa publicly would only destroy the last pieces of my family. Perhaps staying silent was still the kind choice. But then, I remembered Angela crying over her husband's medical bills. I remembered Maria counting coins by the vending machine. I remembered Vanessa calling living human beings dead weight. Suddenly my hesitation vanished. An hour later, I stood before the mirror, putting on the pearl earrings Richard had given me with trembling hands. For the first time in years, I didn't look like an invisible housekeeper. I looked like Penelope Perez again. The drive downtown felt surreal. Snow fell across Michigan Avenue, and holiday lights reflected on the icy pavements. Chicago looked beautiful in the winter, but the cold always made loneliness feel sharper. When I finally arrived outside the hotel, reporters crowded the entrance. No one recognized me at first, until a valet suddenly widened his eyes. "Mrs. Perez." I smiled gently. "Good evening, Daniel."
His face went pale instantly.
Word travelled quickly. As I walked into the lobby, whispers began spreading among the staff. "It's her." "Oh my God, is that Penelope Perez?" The energy around me shifted immediately. Some staff members stood up straighter. Others stared in disbelief. And deep inside me, sorrow settled once again. The same person, different clothes, entirely different treatment. That alone explained exactly what was wrong with this world. The ballroom entrance sparkled with golden lights and towering white floral arrangements. Vanessa stood at the front, welcoming investors with practiced grace, while photographers snapped photos. She looked radiant, confident, and untouchable. Until she saw me. The change on her face was instantaneous. First confusion, then disbelief, followed by panic. Her smile nearly collapsed. I walked slowly toward her across the marble floor, my heels making a soft clicking sound over the ambient music. The conversations around us began to quiet down. Vanessa recovered quickly, forcing another smile. "Penelope," she said, her voice tight. "You made it. I was invited. Not by me, I assume." A moment later, Michael appeared by her side. The colour drained from his face the instant he saw me. "Mum," his voice was barely a whisper. I saw it immediately. The gown, the posture, the confidence. For the first time in years, my son remembered exactly who I used to be. Vanessa took a quick step closer, lowering her voice. "What are you doing?" I met her gaze calmly. "Attending the dinner. You could have at least warned us." An interesting choice of words, as if she truly believed she had the right to stand as an equal to me at this moment. A photographer suddenly stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter Perez, can we get a few more photos near the stage?" Vanessa stood up straight again instantly. The perfect image was restored. "Of course," she replied smoothly. Then she turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It might be best if you stay toward the back tonight. The investors might get confused." There it was again. Even now, even with me wearing silk and pearls, she still thought I was beneath her. Michael looked horrified hearing that. "Vanessa?" But she completely ignored him. I simply smiled softly. "No," I replied. "I think tonight everyone has a right to a clear account. Something in my tone made her uneasy. I saw it immediately. Good. The ballroom filled quickly after that. Hundreds of guests gathered under the glittering chandeliers as servers moved through the crowd with champagne. I noticed the staff in every corner staring at me. Angela nearly dropped her tray when she saw me near the entrance. Her eyes went wide, her expression so dramatic I almost laughed. "Penelope," she whispered as I approached quietly. I touched her arm gently. "Please don't panic." "You're Mrs. Perez?" I nodded. Poor Angela looked like she might faint at any moment. "Oh, my lord." "I'm still me," I said softly. Her eyes instantly filled with tears. In that moment, a painful realization hit me. The staff here showed more genuine emotion seeing me than my own son did. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood on the stage preparing for the opening remarks, the event lights flashing behind her. She looked flawless, but also fearful, because now she understood that something was wrong. Very wrong. Marcus approached me quietly near the back wall, holding a glass of champagne. "The board is ready," he murmured. "Robert arrived 10 minutes ago." I nodded slowly. Robert Sinclair had been a board member since the early days of the company. Unlike Vanessa, Robert knew exactly who this company belonged to, and tonight he intended to make sure everyone else knew it too. Michael suddenly walked across the ballroom toward me, looking deeply unsettled. "Mom," he whispered, "what is this about?" I studied my son closely. Even now, a part of me wanted to protect him. That is the sorrow of a mother's love. No matter how deeply your child wounds you, there is always a corner of your heart that wants to shield them. "You'll understand very soon," I answered gently. Michael looked genuinely frightened now. "Please don't do this publicly." The phrase said everything. It wasn't "please tell me I'm wrong," or "please say Vanessa misunderstood." No, his fear was entirely focused on the embarrassment, the image, just like Vanessa. I looked at him sadly. "Your father used to say that the truth only becomes dangerous after people avoid it for too long." Before Michael could respond, the ballroom speakers came alive with dramatic music. The presentation was beginning. Vanessa walked to the center of the stage, smiling brilliantly under the applause. She looked every bit the rightful queen of the Perez Hospitality Group. Perhaps that was the saddest part, because she truly believed the throne belonged to her. The lights dimmed, and the guests turned toward the stage. Vanessa gracefully lifted the microphone. Yet deep beneath the glamour, the chandeliers and the champagne, the foundation of her perfect world had already begun to crumble. Vanessa stood center stage under the cascading crystal lights, her radiant smile suggesting the entire evening belonged to her. And in her mind, it did. The ballroom sparkled with gold and silver around her. Hundreds of guests, listening intently from candlelit tables. Investors from New York sat in the front row alongside politicians and luxury hospitality executives. Photographers lined the edges of the room, waiting for the perfect shot. Vanessa was completely in her element. "It is my absolute honor to welcome you all tonight," she began smoothly, her voice echoing through the speakers. "The Perez Hospitality Group represents more than just excellence. It represents vision, innovation, and transformation." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. I stood in the back next to Angela, who looked like she might faint every time she glanced my way.
Across the room, Michael stood stiffly by the stage stairs. At some point during the opening remarks, his face had gone completely pale. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how bad it was.
In today's world, luxury hospitality must evolve. We cannot survive by clinging to outdated systems or emotional decisions. The statement earned approving nods from several investors. I noticed Marcus Hill briefly close his eyes in frustration. Vanessa's smile widened. The future of our company relies on a decisive leadership team willing to embrace change. There it was again. Change. What a beautiful word when used honestly, but incredibly dangerous when used to mask greed. She spent the next 10 minutes speaking about growth projections, rebranding, luxury expansion, and market positioning. Every phrase sounded perfectly polished and rehearsed, but the more she spoke, the sadder I felt. Richard had built this company around people, while Vanessa was trying to rebuild it around an illusion. Finally, she raised her champagne glass, gracefully, to the future of the Perez Hospitality Group. The ballroom erupted into warm applause. Then, smiling toward the front tables, she added casually, None of this would be possible without the exceptional executive leadership team my husband and I have built together. My husband and I saw Michael flinch slightly. Even now, she put herself first. Just as Vanessa prepared to step away from the microphone, another voice echoed through the ballroom. Actually, Robert Sinclair said, standing calmly from his front row seat. Before we continue, there is one more acknowledgement that must be made tonight. The entire room went quiet. Vanessa blinked in surprise. Robert adjusted his suit jacket and walked slowly toward the stage. At 74, he still carried an effortless authority that never required a raised voice to command a room. Vanessa forced another smile. Of course, Robert. He took the microphone gently from her hand. I have served the Perez Hospitality Group for nearly 40 years, he began. During that time, I have witnessed extraordinary leadership. His gaze moved slowly across the ballroom. I watched Richard Perez and his wife build this company from a single roadside motel into one of the most respected hospitality groups in the country. Low murmurs spread through the crowd. Vanessa's smile froze. Robert continued. While many people in this room tonight believe they know who leads this company, he paused intentionally, very few know who actually owns it. A dead silence fell over the room. I saw Vanessa's posture rigidify instantly. Michael looked completely frozen. Robert turned slightly toward the back of the ballroom. Tonight, he said clearly, I would like to officially introduce the absolute majority owner of the Perez Hospitality Group. My heart slowed down, not speeding up, but slowing. It was a strange calm, the kind of peace that comes when the truth is finally brought to light. Robert smiled. Mrs. Penelope Perez? The ballroom erupted into a wave of confused whispers. Hundreds of heads turned, searching for me. Vanessa let out a sharp, nervous laugh. What? She muttered under her breath. I began walking forward, and the crowd automatically parted around me. Investors stared openly, while the staff looked absolutely stunned. A woman in the front row gasped. Oh my God! My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as I approached the stage. The colour had completely vanished from Vanessa's face. No, she whispered. No, that's impossible. Michael looked like he couldn't breathe. I walked up the stage steps as photographers began snapping photos rapidly from every direction. When I reached Robert, he respectfully offered his arm. The gesture nearly broke my heart, because in that moment, an old friend showed me more public respect than my own family had in years. Robert handed me the microphone. The ballroom was completely silent. Vanessa stared at me, her eyes wide with panic and confusion. This isn't funny, she hissed quietly to Michael. But Michael didn't answer. Deep down, my son had long suspected the truth. He just never expected it to surface like this. Robert gestured toward the massive presentation screen behind us. Within seconds, the official legal trust documents appeared for the entire room to see. Perez Family Trust, majority shareholder, Penelope Perez. Authorized financial signatory, Penelope Perez. A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. Vanessa took a step back. No, she said again. There must be some mistake. Marcus slowly stood up from his seat in the front row. There is no mistake, he said firmly. All eyes turned to him. As Chief Financial Officer, Marcus continued, I can confirm that every major financial authorization within the Perez Hospitality Group requires approval from the Perez Family Trust. He paused. And Mrs. Penelope Perez has always maintained sole control of that trust. The shock on Vanessa's face looked almost painful. Then came the final blow. Marcus looked straight at her. That includes every single executive compensation check issued over the past several years. The room erupted into chatter. Vanessa's breathing became uneven. She slowly, almost mechanically, turned her gaze toward me.
Suddenly she understood.
Every paycheck, every luxury bonus, every reimbursement from the designer expense accounts, every bit of the wealth she flaunted had been signed and approved by the woman she called trash. My son looked broken, not angry, but entirely defeated. For the first time, Michael truly saw the full devastation caused by his long silence. Vanessa shook her head frantically. You were working housekeeping? She whispered fiercely at me. Why would you do that? I looked at her calmly. To find out exactly how the staff was being treated. The answer was more powerful than any shout. Vanessa's lips parted slightly. Around us, the employees stood frozen in disbelief. I noticed Angela openly crying near the entrance. and Maria covering her mouth with trembling hands. Many of them finally understood why I had listened patiently when others looked away, because this company had never stopped belonging to me. Vanessa turned sharply to Michael. "You knew!" His face twisted in pain. No. The response shattered something inside her. If Michael hadn't known, her entire world had been built on a massive assumption. A dangerous assumption. She looked back at me, desperation creeping into her voice. "You let me embarrass myself in front of everyone." I watched her calmly. "No, Vanessa," I said softly. "You embarrassed yourself." The silence that followed felt incredibly long. Then Robert stepped beside me once again. "There will be further statements regarding company leadership and restructuring," he informed the guests calmly. But tonight, we felt it necessary to honour the woman whose integrity has protected this company since before many of us even arrived. A lone clapping started somewhere in the back. Then another person joined, and another, until thunderous applause echoed through the ballroom. It wasn't for the glamour, the brand, or the image. It was for dignity. I looked out at the crowd, through the tears blurring my eyes. Standing under those chandeliers, as the empire Richard and I built finally recovered its soul, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel powerful. I felt free. The applause lasted longer than Vanessa could tolerate. I saw it on her face. Every clap felt like another crack in the perfect image she had carefully constructed over the years. She stood frozen center stage, her breathing shallow, as camera flashes continued to burst across the ballroom. Investors whispered behind their raised champagne glasses. The staff now stared openly, no longer hiding their shock. For the first time since I met her, Vanessa looked incredibly small. Not because she had lost her position, but because the truth had stripped away her performance. Michael still hadn't moved. He stood by the stage stairs, staring at me as if he no longer recognized the woman he had spent years quietly pushing into the background. Perhaps he didn't. Perhaps I had faded so completely that even my own son had forgotten who I used to be. Robert leaned in gently. "Would you like to say a few words?" I looked out at the ballroom, seeing Angela wiping away tears against the back wall, Maria holding tightly to another housekeeper's hand, and the servers standing entirely still beside their silver trays. I looked at Vanessa, whose world built on designer heels had just collapsed completely. Suddenly I realized this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. I stepped slowly toward the microphone, and the ballroom fell quiet once again. Richard and I built the Paris Hospitality Group," I began softly. "We only had 12 rooms and a leaking roof." A light murmur of laughter passed through the crowd. I smiled faintly. Our very first guest complained that the water heater broke down every other day. Richard spent nights repairing the plumbing while I was pregnant with Michael, cleaning the rooms. My son lowered his head instantly. "We were poor back then," I continued, "but we promised each other something very important." I paused. "We would never forget the people who do the hardest work." Complete silence met my words. I turned slowly toward the employees standing along the walls, the housekeepers, kitchen staff, maintenance workers, laundry staff, and servers. My throat tightened slightly. The people whose names the wealthy guests rarely remember. Several staff members began wiping away tears. Then I looked directly at Vanessa. Yet over the past few years, I've heard the employees of this company referred to as a burden. Vanessa swallowed hard. I continued calmly. "Dead weight." A wave of discomfort rippled through the crowd. "Old trash." This time, the silence grew painful. Vanessa's face turned bright red as everyone finally understood. Those insults were no longer rumors. They had come directly from her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet truth carries much further than a scream. "I spent 3 years working in our hotels wearing a housekeeping uniform," I said. Not because I was ashamed of my name. I scanned the ballroom carefully, but because I wanted to find out if this company still remembered its soul. Across the room, Angela cried openly, covering her mouth. I pointed gently toward the staff gathered by the walls. "These are the people who carried this company through holidays, blizzards, pandemics, and personal family tragedies." I looked back at Vanessa, and some of them were rewarded with humiliation. Vanessa finally took a sharp step forward, interrupting desperately. "That's not fair!" Her sudden shout startled the room. She looked around frantically. You're painting me as a cruel person. I met her gaze firmly. You called living human beings dead weight. Vanessa's breathing became rapid. I was discussing business efficiency.
No, I countered softly. You were talking about people.
Murmurs spread through the crowd. Vanessa turned instantly to Michael. Say something. My son looked completely heartbroken. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. What was left to defend? The truth lay open before everyone. Vanessa looked back at me with growing desperation. You worked housekeeping behind my back for years. I worked alongside the employees you refused to look in the eye. This is manipulation. Her accusation echoed through the hall. For the first time all evening, I felt a spark of anger. Not because she attacked me, but because even now, after everything, she refused to admit her mistakes. She still viewed herself as the victim. I stepped closer to her calmly. No, Vanessa, I said quietly. Manipulation is pretending compassion weakens a company while secretly diverting corporate funds to pay for luxury dinners and personal branding. The last bit of colour drained from her face completely. Michael's head snapped up instantly. What? Whispers erupted across the ballroom once again. Vanessa turned to him sharply. Michael, don't listen to this right now. But Marcus Hill was already walking toward the stage, holding a thin folder. He handed the documents directly to Robert. Robert opened the folder calmly, then addressed the ballroom. An internal audit into executive expenditure practices is currently under review. Vanessa's voice rose sharply. You audited me?
The panic in her tone confirmed everything to the room.
Michael stared at her in disbelief. Vanessa, what is he talking about? She gripped his arm tightly. This is why your mother is doing this publicly. She wants to humiliate me.
Humiliation. What an interesting choice of words. I remembered her mocking my shoes in that laundry room. I remembered her ordering me to use only the service elevators because guests complained. I remembered her calling me trash in front of the staff. But in her mind, only her humiliation mattered.
Michael slowly pulled his arm from her grip. You misused company funds? Vanessa's eyes flashed angrily. Oh, please. Everyone uses company expenses. Marcus spoke firmly from the side of the stage. But not everyone charges luxury jewelry purchases to the hotel entertainment accounts.
The ballroom nearly exploded with whispers.
Vanessa looked cornered now, utterly desperate. And desperate people always revealed their truest selves. Suddenly she pointed directly at me. This is because she never accepted me. The room fell into a dead silence once more. Vanessa's voice broke with emotion, completely unraveled now. She looked down on me from the very beginning because I wasn't wealthy enough for this family. The statement caught me off guard, not because it was true, but because she genuinely believed it. I looked at her sadly.
Vanessa, no.
Yes, she shouted suddenly. You've been judging me the entire time. My chest felt an unexpected pang because beneath all the arrogance and cruelty, I clearly saw a shadow of who she used to be. The frightened poor girl from Texas. The girl who hid her thrift store shoes in a school locker, terrified of feeling worthless again. But pain does not excuse cruelty. I spoke to her gently. I never cared where you came from, Vanessa. Vanessa let out a bitter, tearful laugh. That's easy for billionaires to say, isn't it? The ballroom remained silent. I watched her for a few seconds before answering quietly. Richard and I used to split a single hamburger for dinner because we couldn't afford two. Vanessa froze. So, no, I continued softly. I have never judged poverty. My voice hardened slightly. What I judge is how you treat others after escaping it. The words hit closer to home than anything else I had said all evening, because deep down, Vanessa knew it was the truth. The silence that followed felt incredibly heavy. Finally, Angela unexpectedly stepped forward from the back of the ballroom, her hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Perez. I looked toward her gently. Angela swallowed hard, then raised her voice so the room could hear. Last year, when my husband's treatments were no longer covered by insurance, someone anonymously paid the remaining balance. Vanessa looked confused. Angela's eyes swam with tears. It was you, Penelope.
More employees in the room began whispering emotionally.
Maria spoke up right after her. She helped pay for my grandson's surgery too. Another voice spoke up. She paid for my daughter's textbooks. Then another. And she never told a soul. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I had never looked for recognition for any of those things. Richard and I simply believed that if you have the ability to help, you do it. That was all. But standing beneath those crystal chandeliers, watching the staff stand up for me, one after another, I finally understood something vital. True leadership isn't built on fear. It is built on the lives you quietly protect when nobody is watching. After that, the ballroom never truly recovered. Even after the music started playing again and the waiters awkwardly resumed serving champagne, the atmosphere had permanently shifted. People huddled together in hushed whispers, and investors nervously checked their phones. The staff looked at Vanessa differently now, not with fear, but with absolute clarity. When a person's power relies entirely on a false image, being seen for who they truly are is the ultimate downfall. I left the dinner shortly before midnight, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was exhausted. It was a profound weariness that comes from finally carrying the truth out into the open after years of silence. By the time I walked out to my car, a soft white layer of snow had already gathered on the windshield. Chicago after midnight seemed quieter, almost gentle. I drove through the empty streets completely alone, as memories replayed in my mind. Michael running down the hotel hallways in his socks when he was just a little boy. Richard teaching him how to shake hands properly with the staff. Vanessa crying in my kitchen years ago, admitting how deeply ashamed she felt about growing up poor. There was so much pain, so many opportunities for us to be better people, but without realizing it, we had all failed each other in different ways. I'd just taken off my earrings at home when there was a knock at the front door. 3 soft taps. I already knew who it was. Michael stood on the porch, looking completely broken. Snow clung to his dark coat, and the cold wind swirled around him. For a moment, he just stared at me without a word. He looked older tonight. Not physically, but emotionally. I silently stepped aside. Come on in. He walked in slowly, looking around the small house, as if he were truly seeing it for the first time in years. The old sofa, the faded curtains, the framed photos on the wall. These were all pieces of a life he had spent so much energy trying to distance himself from. Out of habit, I walked toward the kitchen. Do you still take your tea with a lot of sugar? A faint, painful smile appeared on his face. Yes. Neither of us spoke while the water boiled. The silence between a mother and a son is different from any other kind of silence. It carries the history. Finally, I placed a steaming mug in front of him at the kitchen table and sat quietly opposite him. Michael wrapped his hands around the cup but didn't drink. At last he asked in a low voice, "Why didn't you tell me?" There it was. Not anger, not rage, but a deep sense of hurt. I looked down at my tea before answering. "Because I wanted you to be your own man." Michael smiled bitterly. "Well, that worked out wonderfully." His voice cracked on the last word. My chest tightened with pain. "You have always been capable, Michael." "No." He shook his head slowly. "Dad was capable. You are capable."
I frowned gently. When you worked side by side with your father, you were just as capable.
Michael stared at the table for a few seconds. Finally, he said the words I think he had been avoiding for years. "I knew Vanessa could be demanding sometimes."
Demanding. What a carefully chosen word to describe cruelty.
"But I didn't realize." His voice caught. "I didn't realize how bad things had gotten." I looked at my son quietly. "No, you did realize." The words hit him heavily. Michael snapped his head up. "You saw her humiliate the staff." Silence. "You saw her insult me." More silence. "You saw her mistake kindness for weakness."
His eyes instantly filled with tears. Suddenly he looked young again. Not the executive, not the husband, just my little boy carrying a burden of guilt he couldn't bear.
"Always thought things would settle down," he whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. That was Michael's greatest flaw. He believed that avoiding conflict would prevent damage. But sometimes avoiding conflict is the very thing that causes the destruction. She controlled everything, he admitted dismally. Every single conversation turned into an argument. Hearing this made my heart ache, not because it excused him, but because I recognized the pure exhaustion in his voice. Vanessa hadn't just dominated the boardroom. She had dominated the emotional space as well. Michael rubbed his face with both hands, looking weary. "When Dad passed away?" He swallowed hard. "Everything changed." I waited in silence. "You disappeared." That sentence stung more than I expected. Michael looked slowly around the kitchen. "You stopped coming to meetings, stopped calling investors, stopped showing up." I was grieving. So was I. The honesty in those words almost broke my heart. Because he was right. Richard's passing had shattered both of us in different ways. I retreated into silence. Michael buried himself in work and his marriage. Neither path healed a thing. For a long time, neither of us said a word. Then Michael asked softly, "Did you really work as a housekeeper all those years just to watch us?" I smiled faintly. "Not at first." "Then what changed?" I looked thoughtfully out the snow-covered window. "At first, I just wanted a simple life. After your father died, the boardroom felt unbearable." Michael nodded slightly, but then I started to see things. I saw fear. The word hung heavily between us. Employees who were terrified of executives, managers obsessed with appearances, people who had completely forgotten how to treat human beings. Michael's face fell. "And me?" I didn't answer right away. A mother spends her entire life trying to protect her child from pain, even when it's pain they deserve. Finally, I whispered, "Yes." Michael lowered his head. I became weak.
"No," I said gently. "You became afraid?"
That brought on quiet tears, starting as a sob and turning into full, heavy weeping. I hadn't seen my son cry since Richard's funeral. Seeing him sit there in his expensive suit, looking completely lost, cut deep into my heart once again. "I let you down," he whispered. No, my own voice surprised me. "You let yourself down." He covered his face with trembling hands. "I did love her. I know. And now I don't even recognize our life." I reached across the table slowly and touched his hand. For several seconds, he gripped my fingers tightly, just like he used to during thunderstorms when he was a little boy. "I should have stood up for you," he whispered. I nodded once. "Yes, you should have. Sometimes the truth matters far more than comfort." Michael took a shaky breath. "She said you embarrassed us." The phrase sat painfully between us. I looked around my small kitchen. It was my existence that embarrassed her, I corrected gently. He wept even harder after that. Eventually he asked the question I think he feared the most. "What happens now?" I thought of Vanessa standing under the crystal chandeliers tonight, watching her perfect world publicly fall apart. I thought of the audits, the investors, the board, the staff. And beneath all of that, I thought of family. A broken family. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted honestly. Michael stared down at his tea. Then he said softly, "She is furious." "I imagine so. She thinks you planned everything just to ruin her." I let out a soft, sad laugh. "No, sweetheart." I looked directly at him. The moment Vanessa stopped treating people like human beings, she ruined herself. Silence filled the kitchen once more. Then Michael finally whispered the words I think he had been wanting to say all night. "I'm so sorry, Mum."
Simple words, long overdue, but they were sincere. Somehow that mattered.
I held his hand gently as the snow continued to fall outside the window. For the first time in so many years, my son was looking directly at me again. Not at Vanessa, not at the investors, not at the image, just at me. Despite all the pain of the evening, that alone felt like a new beginning. The audit officially began on Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the entire executive floor felt like a building waiting for an earthquake. No one was smiling anymore. Assistants whispered behind half-closed office doors. Department heads suddenly avoided eye contact in the hallways. Security guards stood near conference rooms, pretending not to listen, while the legal team hurried between offices carrying stacks of documents. The fear had shifted sides, and Vanessa hated every single second of it. Just after 8 a.m., I arrived at the hotel. Instead of my housekeeping uniform, I wore a beige wool coat for the first time in years. The staff's reaction was immediate. People stood up straighter the moment they saw me. Some smiled nervously, while others looked visibly emotional. Angela almost dropped her clipboard when I approached the front desk. "You look beautiful," she whispered. I gently touched her arm. "How is your husband doing?" "He starts his treatments again next week." Her eyes immediately welled with tears, relieved by the insurance decision. I nodded slowly. The planned layoffs had been officially frozen on Friday night after the dinner. It was the very first directive I issued upon taking over. Though no official announcement had been made yet, the staff was already hearing the rumors. This time, they were good rumors. As I stepped into the executive elevator, I caught a brief glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored walls. For years, I had deliberately hidden myself away. Now, I felt the entire building shifting around me. Not because I had changed, but because the truth had changed what people were allowed to see. When I reached the top floor, the boardroom doors were wide open. Inside, the tension was thick enough to feel. Marcus sat at the far end of the long table, flanked by 2 outside legal counsels who were reviewing the audit summary. Robert Sinclair stood quietly by the window, while a few board members whispered among themselves. And Vanessa? Vanessa looked consumed with rage, no longer afraid, just furious. She sat rigidly at the conference table, dressed from head to toe in black, looking like someone attending a funeral. Perhaps she was. Michael stood near the coffee station, looking exhausted beyond words. The moment he saw me walk in, his expression softened slightly. Vanessa noticed immediately, and her jaw tightened. Robert cleared his throat gently. "Shall we begin?" Nobody answered. The lead auditor calmly opened a thick folder. "Over the past 18 months, he started, multiple executive expenses were improperly categorized under hotel branding and corporate development accounts." Vanessa crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous," the auditor continued, completely unfazed. Several of these expenditures were clearly personal in nature. The projection screen behind him lit up. Records of luxury jewelry purchases, private spa invoices, designer consultation contracts, and international travel completely unrelated to business operations. Every single item listed transaction dates and authorization paths. The room was dead silent, save for the click of the slides changing. Michael stared at the screen, watching his life publicly unravel. Vanessa finally snapped. "Every single executive in the hospitality industry spends money on image management." Marcus spoke calmly from across the table, but not through hidden reimbursement structures. Vanessa turned on him fiercely. "Oh, please, Marcus, don't start acting like a moral authority now." He didn't react. This seemed to enrage her even more. The auditor switched to another slide. This time, internal emails appeared on the screen. Vanessa's face drained of color instantly. She recognized them immediately. One email read, "Older staff members hurt our luxury perception metrics." Another stated, "Housekeeping staff must remain visually invisible during investor events." A heavy silence filled the room. I saw several board members exchange uncomfortable looks. An older investor muttered under his breath, "Good Lord." Vanessa stood up abruptly. "You are taking all of this completely out of context." "No," Robert said quietly. "I don't think we are." Her breathing became entirely uneven. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa looked truly cornered. And beneath the anger, I finally saw something else clearly. Fear. Raw fear. Because people who build their identity entirely on status fall into total panic the moment they lose control over how the world sees them. Vanessa's entire world depended on looking powerful. Now she stood exposed. Michael finally spoke, his voice raspy. "Why didn't you tell me about these expenses?" Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "You are questioning me now?" Yes. That single word shifted the atmosphere in the room, because for the first time in years, Michael sounded completely resolute. Vanessa noticed too. "You signed off on those approvals yourself," she fired back. "Because I trusted you." "Oh, come off it." She let out a bitter laugh. "Don't start acting innocent all of a sudden." Pain flashed across Michael's face. Unfortunately, she wasn't entirely wrong. When silence is maintained long enough, it becomes a form of complicity. Vanessa looked wildly around the room. 6 months ago, you all loved me," she said sharply. Now suddenly everyone is acting shocked. No one answered, because again, she wasn't completely wrong. Powerful people often tolerate cruelty until the consequences of that cruelty are brought into the light. The lead auditor cleared his throat carefully. Additionally, there are concerns regarding potentially discriminatory staffing practices.
Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. "Because I wanted efficiency?"
Because multiple employees over the age of 55 were specifically targeted for termination. She let out a harsh laugh. "This is a business, not a daycare center." That statement ended everything. I watched it happen in real time. The final collapse. Hearing those words, even the faces around the table that had held on to some lingering sympathy went completely cold. Because arrogance to that degree is impossible to defend. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Then he asked the most important question. "Did you ever actually care about the staff?" Vanessa froze. "What?" "The people who work for us." His voice cracked slightly. "Did they ever matter to you at all?" For a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine emotion crossed her face. Then the anger returned. I cared about protecting this company. No, I said softly from the other side of the room. You only cared about controlling how it looked.
Vanessa turned on me instantly. And you, she hissed, hiding in a housekeeping uniform just to judge everyone.
I met her gaze calmly. I was listening. You humiliated me in front of everyone. My chest tightened slightly. You humiliated yourself long before that dinner ever happened. The room fell into silence once more. Vanessa's eyes suddenly filled with tears. Not tears of weakness, but tears of pure frustration. I spent my entire life trying to escape being poor. That confession hung heavily in the boardroom. For a painful second, I saw glimpses of the young woman she used to be. The scared girl from Texas. The girl who was ashamed of her second-hand shoes. The girl who desperately never wanted to feel powerless again. But somewhere along the way, Vanessa had confused superiority with dignity, and that confusion had ruined everything. Michael looked at her sadly. You became cruel. She let out a tearful, bitter laugh. And you became weak. The words stung him deeply. Vanessa then stood entirely still, her breathing ragged. Finally, she asked the question she dreaded the most. What happens to me now? Robert answered gently but firmly. The board has voted to suspend your duties immediately, pending the final legal review. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. You can't do this. I believe we can. She turned her desperate gaze to Michael. Say something. My son looked utterly devastated, but this time he didn't stay silent. I can't protect you from the consequences of this anymore. That phrase shattered her completely. Vanessa stepped back slowly, as if she had been physically struck. Then, without another word, she grabbed her bag and walked out of the boardroom.
Nobody stopped her.
The ensuing silence felt immense. Long after the door closed, Michael kept staring at it. I watched my son closely, because the pain of losing an illusion is almost as intense as the pain of losing a loved one. Finally, he whispered almost to himself, I didn't know things had gone this far. I looked at him with sorrow. Sometimes people don't realize the house is on fire, I said, because they've grown used to living in the smoke. By Friday morning, the story had made the front pages of every major business media outlet in the country. Before sunrise, television screens and social media were flooded with the news. Luxury executive exposed in corporate scandal. Mystery hotel owner revealed at public gala. The standoff, housekeeper turns out to be billionaire founder. And worst of all for Vanessa, executive accused of referring to staff as dead weight. The internet devoured stories like this, especially those about arrogance collapsing in public. I sat quietly in my kitchen watching the morning news, the cup of coffee beside me turning cold and completely untouched. Every channel replayed clips from the dinner. Vanessa's shocked expression. The applause after Robert introduced me. The exact moment Marcus confirmed the signature on the checks. Commentators analysed body language like they were dissecting courtroom evidence. But beneath all the noise, something else bothered me. People weren't discussing human compassion. They were discussing the spectacle. That is how modern culture handles pain. It turns it into entertainment. My phone rang continuously. Board members, investors, reporters, old friends I hadn't heard from in years. I ignored most of them. Then Margaret called. She made a public statement, she said immediately. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she would. What did she say? She gave an interview early this morning. Margaret hesitated. She claims you orchestrated a campaign of public humiliation against her. I let out a soft laugh, though I didn't find it funny at all. Anything else? She implied that the family has been manipulating her from the very beginning. That part hurt more than expected. Not because it would damage my reputation, but because deep down, I knew Vanessa truly believed it. Pain can distort memories, especially when accountability finally arrives. Margaret sighed gently. Robert wants to hold an official press conference this afternoon. No, there was a pause on the other line. No, I will handle it myself. Silence lingered on the phone for a moment. Then Margaret replied softly, Richard would be so proud of you today. Those words nearly brought me to tears. The press conference was set for 4 p.m. in the main ballroom of the flagship hotel, the very room where everything had collapsed just days prior. By 3:30 p.m., reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, filling the lobby entrance. Flashbulbs bounced off the marble floors as hotel security struggled to control the noise. Upstairs in a private waiting room, Michael stood by the window, silently gazing out at the Chicago skyline. He looked exhausted, having barely slept all week. Neither had I. "You don't have to face this alone," he said softly when I walked in. I managed a small smile. "Neither do you."
For a few seconds, we just stood there in the quiet. Then Michael spoke again.
"Vanessa moved out last night." The sadness in his voice almost broke my heart. Not because I missed Vanessa, but because I hated watching my son mourn the life he thought he had. "Are you okay?" I asked gently. He let out a bitter chuckle. "Honestly, no. It's good, our healing starts right there." Michael rubbed his forehead wearily. "She said I betrayed her."
I looked at him closely. What do you think?
He swallowed hard. "I think I betrayed everyone else." That answer showed more maturity than anything I had heard from him in years. Before I could respond, a staff member knocked lightly on the door. "Mrs. Perez, they are ready for you." The ballroom below went completely silent as I walked onto the stage. Hundreds of journalists watched me under the bright television lights. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Questions were waiting in their eyes. I walked slowly to the podium, while Michael stood a few feet behind me, off to the side of the stage. For a moment, I just looked out at the room. Then I began. "My name is Penelope Perez." My voice echoed softly through the ballroom. For many years, following the passing of my husband, I chose to step away from the public eye. The room was perfectly still. Richard Perez firmly believed that a business should prioritize caring for people over chasing profits. I paused. Yet somewhere along the way, our company lost sight of that vision. Reporters scribbled notes quickly. Flashbulbs flickered. One journalist immediately raised a hand. "Mrs. Perez, did you intentionally hide your ownership from your daughter-in-law?" "I hid my ownership from almost everyone." "Why?" I thought about it carefully. "Because grief changes a person." The ballroom grew even quieter. For a long time after my husband died, I didn't recognize myself anymore. Working quietly in our hotels reminded me of exactly who he built this company for in the first place. Another reporter spoke up. "Did you truly work as a housekeeper for several years?" "Yes." Whispers immediately rippled through the crowd. "Why would a controlling owner clean hotel rooms?" I smiled sadly. "Because there is dignity in honest labor." A dead silence followed my answer. An older journalist slowly lowered his notebook. Before more questions could interrupt, I continued. "The employees of the Perez Hospitality Group are not invisible. They are not expendable. And they are absolutely not a burden." Several staff members, standing along the back wall of the ballroom, began to silently weep. I noticed Angela among them. Another reporter stood up. "What is your response to Vanessa Carter Perez's claim that she was publicly humiliated?" The question hung heavily in the room. I could have completely destroyed Vanessa right there, listing every single expense, every insult, and every cruel act. Instead, I took a deep breath. I believe that pain often distorts people into versions of themselves they no longer recognize. The room remained hushed. "I do not hate Vanessa," I continued softly, which visibly surprised many people. "She grew up with a terrifying fear of being powerless. Unfortunately, some people respond to fear by trying to control everyone else." A young reporter frowned. "So you forgive her?" Forgiveness. What a complicated word. I believe that accountability and empathy can exist at the same time. That answer felt closest to the truth. Just then, something unexpected happened. Michael stepped forward to stand right beside me. The ballroom instantly erupted into a flurry of whispers. My son looked terrified, but entirely resolved. He faced the cameras slowly. My mother deserved better from me. Every single reporter in the room went still. Michael swallowed hard and continued. "I saw behavior years ago that I should have stopped, but I stayed silent because I was afraid of conflict." His voice caught slightly. That silence hurt the staff. It hurt my family, and most of all, it hurt my mother. My eyes misted over instantly, because those words weren't polished or rehearsed. They were real. Michael turned to me briefly. "I am deeply sorry." The ballroom was completely motionless. Near the back rows, I could hear someone quietly crying.
Finally, a reporter asked softly, "Mrs. Perez, after everything that has happened, what matters most to you now?"
I looked around the entire ballroom carefully, taking in the journalists, the staff, the cameras, and this company that Richard and I had built from nothing. Ultimately, I answered with complete honesty. I want people to remember that success means absolutely nothing if you lose your humanity along the way. Silence. Then, somewhere near the back, someone began to clap softly. It wasn't a thunderous applause, nor was it dramatic. It was a gentle, human applause. As I stood beside my son under the crystal chandeliers with flashbulbs continuously blinking for the first time in years, the Paris hospitality group finally felt like it belonged to us again. 3 weeks after the press conference, the penthouse no longer seemed quite so grand. It looked lonely. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows still overlooked the Chicago skyline, and the marble floors still reflected the city lights after dark. The expensive artwork remained perfectly aligned on the white walls, but luxury without warmth felt strangely empty. Vanessa sat alone at the kitchen island, wearing an oversized sweater instead of a designer evening gown. Her makeup-free face carried a weariness I had never seen on her before. No photographers, no investors, no assistants following behind with coffee and schedules. Only silence. It was ironic how quickly people vanish when status disappears. Several magazines had already replaced her in their Women in Luxury Business features with the younger, rising executives. Former social circle friends suddenly stopped returning calls. Invitations dried up almost overnight. Even the internet's attention had moved on. For most people, a scandal is just short-term entertainment, but the consequences left behind for those involved are long-lasting. Vanessa stared blankly at her untouched glass of wine as rain tapped against the windows. Michael had officially moved out 4 days ago. There was no drama, no screaming, no broken plates, just exhaustion. He quietly packed 2 suitcases and left before sunrise. That kind of ending hurts even more. The penthouse intercom suddenly buzzed. Vanessa frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone anymore. Most people only visited when the penthouse represented some form of leverage. She pressed the button, naturally irritated. "Who is it?" "It's me, Penelope." Silence. A long silence. Finally, "Come on up." When the elevator doors opened, I barely recognized her. Vanessa used to walk into a room carrying a calculated confidence. Even her posture seemed to demand attention. Now she looked somehow smaller, like a regular person. As she saw me walk in, she crossed her arms tightly. "I suppose you're here to finish humiliating me." I slowly took off my gloves. If I wanted to humiliate you, my statement at the press conference would have been entirely different. Vanessa smiled bitterly. That was pity. Yes. The answer unsettled her immediately. She turned her gaze to the city lights outside. The penthouse felt colder than usual. Not physically cold, but emotionally cold. I looked around quietly. Richard used to say, "A house absorbs the energy of the people living inside it." This place had absorbed tension, fear, and pretense. Vanessa pulled her arms tighter. "Michael told me you stopped the layoffs." "I did." "An expanded healthcare coverage?" "Yes." Her jaw tightened slightly. "That isn't how the corporate world operates right now." I looked at her closely. "No," I said softly, "but it is exactly how a good business should operate." She didn't answer. For a few moments the rain gently tapped against the windows while the city flickered beneath us. Then Vanessa spoke again, suddenly. "Do you know what the worst part is?" I waited. I actually thought they respected me. There it was. The real wound. Not the money, not the status. The validation. Vanessa walked slowly toward the kitchen counter. "They're all gone," she whispered. "Every single one of them." I watched her attentively. When people love your image instead of your character, they leave the moment the image cracks. Vanessa let out a tearful, bitter laugh. "You sound like a therapist." You, I smiled sadly. "Just old." That almost made her smile. Almost. She leaned against the counter, staring down at her wine glass. "When I was 13, she said softly, "my family had our electricity shut off for 2 weeks. I remained silent. My mother hid in the bathroom and cried because she couldn't pay the bill." Her voice sounded distant now, like it was coming from far away. I remember promising myself that I would never experience that kind of powerlessness again. The pain spread quietly through the room. Not a dramatic pain, but the exhausting kind that people carry for years without even realizing it's controlling them. "I understand that fear," I said gently. Vanessa snapped her head up. "No, you don't." "I do." She shook her head immediately. "You had Richard. You had money." I took a slow step closer.
When Richard and I opened our first motel, the two of us shared one winter coat because we couldn't afford two.
That made her freeze. We cleaned the rooms ourselves, I continued, sometimes working until 3 in the morning. Vanessa stared at me blankly. I know what fear feels like. Silence filled the room once more. Then she finally asked in a whisper, "Then why do you hate me?" The question brought an unexpected ache to my heart, because deep down, she truly believed it. I shook my head slowly. "I have never hated you." "You do." "No," my voice softened. "I was heartbroken watching you become cruel." Her eyes filled with tears instantly. "You judged me. I pitied you." That phrase shattered something inside her. Vanessa turned away quickly, tears streaming down her face, completely unable to stop them. "You have no idea what it's like to be looked down on." I thought of the laundry room, the housekeeping cart, the service elevators, and the word trash. "Then," I answered sincerely. "I do now." She closed her eyes. For several seconds, only the sound of the rain filled the silence between us. Then Vanessa finally whispered the truth, hidden beneath everything else. "I was jealous of you." I frowned slightly. "Jealous of me? You always seemed so at peace." Her voice broke. "Even when people ignored you." In that moment, I understood. Vanessa had mistaken peace for weakness because she had never learned how to create peace for herself on the inside. Instead, she spent her entire life performing to prove she was worthy. "I spent years trying to be someone important," she admitted tremblingly. "And you somehow walk into any room and just are." It almost broke my heart because she still didn't completely understand. True dignity has nothing to do with wealth. It comes from how you treat people when they can offer you no benefit.
I sat down slowly across from her.
"Vanessa." She wiped the tears from her cheeks angrily. "I know I ruined everything." I thought about those words carefully. "No," I said gently, "not everything." She laughed bitterly. "Michael left. He needs space. He hates me." I thought about my son. "No," I answered honestly. "Michael hates who he was when he was around you." That silence felt important because it was true. Vanessa looked slowly around the empty penthouse. "Now all of this feels completely pointless." I followed her gaze across the luxury apartment. The crystal chandeliers, the marble, the skyline, the expense of emptiness. Then I softly repeated something Richard had told me during our poorest years. "Power without kindness only ever ends in loneliness." Vanessa stared at me silently, and for the first time since I had known her, she stopped defending herself. She was listening, truly listening. "I don't know how to start over," she whispered. I looked at the scared woman sitting across from me. Not the executive, not the socialite, not the villain everyone online hated. Just a wounded ordinary person who had built her entire identity on running away from shame.
Suddenly, I understood a painful truth. People who fear humiliation often become experts at humiliating others first.
I stood up slowly and picked up my coat. Before leaving, I walked over to her one last time. "The way you start over," I said gently, "is by learning to see people before you judge them." Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. I touched her shoulder lightly, not because she had entirely earned forgiveness. We weren't there yet, but because hatred destroys the person carrying it just the same. Then I walked out of the penthouse, leaving the rain still falling over the Chicago skyline behind me. And for the first time in a very long time, Vanessa Carter Perez sat there completely alone, with nothing left to hide behind except the truth. Spring arrived quietly that year. After months of ice and grey skies, Chicago finally thawed, and the city softened piece by piece. Sidewalk cafes reopened, the trees along Michigan Avenue began to turn green, and people's smiles became lighter as the sun returned. Healing feels a bit like that, slow, uneven, but hopeful. 6 months after the dinner, the Paris Hospitality Group looked different. Not a flashy kind of different, but human. The first major policy change I approved was expanding healthcare benefits for long-term employees. Retirement support plans were strengthened. For the first time in years, employee appreciation bonuses were reinstated. Most importantly, all executives were now required to spend 1 week each year working directly in frontline operations. Housekeeping, laundry, kitchen, front desk service. No exceptions. Marcus joked that half the executives nearly fainted after moving luggage carts for an afternoon. Good. People should understand the labor that supports their comfort. I still visited the flagship hotel frequently, though no longer in secret. Strangely, the staff treated me almost exactly the same as before. Angela would still scold me for skipping lunch. Maria would still force homemade cookies into my bag. The only difference now was that people no longer apologized for existing around executives. That mattered more than anyone realized. On a warm Thursday morning, I walked through the hotel lobby and noticed Michael near the front desk, helping an elderly couple with their luggage. I paused quietly. 6 months ago, my son would have immediately delegated that task to someone else. Now he carried a warm smile, personally helping the couple guide their bags into the elevator. When he finally noticed me, a look of slight embarrassment flashed across his face. "What?" he asked somewhat defensively. I smiled. "Your father used to move luggage too." That brought a soft laugh out of him. Michael was slowly changing after Vanessa left. It wasn't dramatic. Real growth rarely is. He went to counselling, reduced his administrative workload, and started listening more during staff meetings instead of hiding behind silence. Sometimes grief matures a person after breaking them completely. Other times, it hardens them forever. I was grateful my son chose the first path. "Coffee later?" he asked. "I'd love that." As we spoke, I noticed a few young employees looking at Michael with a sense of cautious respect, rather than fear. That was new, too. Respect earned sincerely is always much quieter than authority demanded loudly. Later that afternoon, I drove through the city to a non-profit community center in the south side of Chicago. The building was unremarkable. Peeling paint, old brick walls, a cramped parking lot. But when I arrived, laughter was drifting out of the open windows. Inside, volunteers were sorting food boxes for low-income families, while children painted at nearby folding tables. Standing near the supply racks, wearing jeans and no makeup, was Vanessa. For a moment she didn't see me. She was kneeling beside a little girl, helping her carefully secure a torn cardboard box with tape. The child suddenly hugged her, and Vanessa let out a soft, surprised laugh. It was a genuine laugh, unpolished and completely unforced, full of humanity. Then she looked up and saw me. Shock flashed briefly across her face before she stood up. "Penelope." "Hello, Vanessa."
She tucked her hair behind her ear, nervously. The designer gowns were gone. The icy assistants and perfectly packaged image were gone. She still looked tired, but somehow lighter.
A coordinator from the non-profit walked over, smiling broadly. "Vanessa absolutely saved our budget," she told me proudly. "She completely reorganized our donation system." Vanessa looked instantly embarrassed. "It was nothing." No, actually it wasn't nothing. That was the whole point. After the coordinator walked away, we stood awkwardly near the supply racks. Finally, Vanessa spoke softly. "I heard about the employee reforms. You're making a difference." I nodded slowly. "I'm glad to hear that." There was a sincerity in her voice now. That mattered. Not because redemption erases the damage caused, but because growth requires honesty first. I looked around the community center. "You seem different here." Vanessa chuckled softly. "I think this is the first job I've had in my life where nobody cares about appearances." "How does it feel?" She considered the question carefully. "Terrifying." Then a faint smile appeared on her face. "But also a little peaceful." I understood exactly what she meant. No longer needing to constantly perform to prove you're worthy is a freedom in itself. Vanessa crossed her arms loosely. "Michael told me you asked the board not to pursue criminal charges against me."
I nodded once.
She lowered her head immediately. "You didn't owe me that." "No, I didn't." Silence settled gently between us. Then Vanessa whispered the words I never truly expected to hear. "I am sorry." No drama, no justifications, just a sincere apology. "I was cruel to you," she continued softly, "and to people who didn't deserve it at all." My chest tightened slightly. I spent so much time wanting to feel what power felt like that I forgot how to just be a decent person. The old Vanessa would have absolutely never admitted that. I studied her closely. "I believe people can change," I said. She smiled sadly. "Even after all of this?" "Yes." "Why?" I thought of Richard, of grief, of Michael weeping at my kitchen table, of Angela's husband making it through treatment. I thought of how easily people who have been hurt go on to hurt others. Then I answered honestly, because if we stop believing people can change, then bitterness and resentment are the only things left for the future. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears instantly. This time, she didn't hide them. Outside the community centre windows, the evening sun bathed the entire city in warmth. For the first time since all of this began, a sense of peace settled deep inside me. Not a perfect peace. Life never gives you perfect peace. But it was enough. Before leaving, I turned to Vanessa one last time. "You know," I said gently, "Richard used to think the true measure of wealth had nothing to do with money." She wiped her eyes carefully. "What did he think it was?" I smiled softly. "It's how many people feel just a little bit safer the moment you walk into the room." Hearing that, Vanessa wept even harder. To be completely honest, so did I. That evening, Michael came over to my small brick house in the suburbs to have dinner with me. There was nothing fancy, just hot soup, bread, and coffee afterward. At one point, he looked around the kitchen and smiled faintly. "You know," he admitted, "I used to think success meant escaping places exactly like this." I reached across the table and held his hand gently. "And now?" Michael looked around the small but warm kitchen, quietly. Then he smiled. "Now I think this might be the wealthiest house I know." Outside, the spring rain tapped lightly against the windows. Inside, the kitchen echoed with laughter that had been missing for far too many years. Somewhere deep down, I finally understood the lesson Richard had always tried to teach us. Money can build hotels, but only kindness can make a person feel at home. After everything that happened, I spent a long time thinking about how easily we judge one another based entirely on appearances. A housekeeping uniform, an old car, a quiet woman standing in the corner of a room. So many people looked at me and decided my worth in their minds before ever knowing my story.
But life has a way of revealing the truth as time moves on. Those who shout the loudest about power are often the ones most terrified of losing it. And those who seem the most ordinary sometimes hold the greatest strength inside.
What happened to my family taught me something I will never forget. Kindness is never weakness. True strength isn't about controlling others, humiliating them, or making yourself feel important by tearing someone else down. True strength is choosing dignity even when you are hurting. It's protecting others when nobody is watching. It's remembering the humanity in employees, strangers, and family members alike. I also learned that silence causes just as much damage to people as cruelty does. My son loved me, but because he was afraid of conflict, he stayed silent for far too long. And fear, if left unchecked, slowly destroys relationships when no one is looking, until suddenly it's too late. But healing is possible. Not a perfect healing, and not an immediate forgiveness. True healing is much slower than that. It starts when people finally choose to speak the truth, take responsibility for their actions, and decide to be better than they were yesterday. If there is one thing I hope you take away from this story, it is this. Never measure a person's value based solely on their job title, age, or social status. Some of the strongest, wisest, and most generous people in this world are often the very ones who get overlooked every single day.
Sometimes the person being ignored is the exact one holding everything together.